Hello, and welcome to the Books Uncovered podcast, a podcast from Fulcrum Publishing where we explore the world of books and the people who make up the publishing industry. I'm Kateri Kramer, the marketing director at Fulcrum Publishing, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kelly Jervey, Fulcrum's marketing coordinator. Today, our guest is Joe Bruchac. For over 40 years, Joe has been creating literature and music that reflect his Indigenous heritage traditions. As an award-winning storyteller, Joe has shared tales of the Adirondacks and the native peoples of the northeastern woodlands around the world. He is the author of more than 120 books for children and adults, and in 1999, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Native Writers Circle of the Americas. Thank you so much for being with us, Joe.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I wanted to start out by asking if you could tell us a little bit about your background, both in writing and more specifically with storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Well, right now I am upstairs in what was my grandparents' general store and gas station. It's the house I was raised in, which has been in my family for many generations. If you count the foundation of the house that was here before, which was burned by some people who did not like my great-grandparents. That's another story. And, I actually grew up at a time where there was no such thing as television. We listened to the radio,
Nice.
where storytelling was paramount. And also, there was a little potbelly stove downstairs in the store. And I would sit around with other people at night in the wintertime and hear stories and songs largely about logging and tall tales, which were told around that little stove. And I grew up learning my ABCs, not A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but A is for X, as you very well know. B for the boys who can swing them also. C is for chopping, so early begun. D for the danger, we oft times must run. So I grew up hearing stories and hearing the oral tradition, although I didn't hear much of the native oral tradition from my own family. I heard it from other people, but in my family, I come from a time not long before I was born when being Native American was a very dangerous thing here in the Northeast. And my grandparents always denied to outsiders their Native ancestry. They simply would say, we're French, and why are you so dark-skinned? Well, us French is always dark. And that's a very common thing for the heritage of Abenaki people, because in Vermont there was actually a eugenics project sterilizing people who were undesirable, including American Indians, and that went on through the 1940s. And there were also all kinds of things that made it very unsafe to be recognized publicly as a Native person, unless you were living on a reservation when you're obviously who you are and the outside world's aware of it. So that is part of my background, and listening has been very important to me. I listened to my grandparents, and listening to elders became very easy to me for having that background of growing up with people around me who were old and who had a lot to say and who had a lot to share. And I discovered that if you are quiet, people will tell you things. Remember, you have 2 ears and only 1 mouth, so listen twice as much as you talk. And by the time I was in high school, I was writing all the time, poems, stories, and I would memorize poetry. I've always loved it. And by the time I went to college, majoring in wildlife conservation because I love the outdoors, I took a few courses in creative writing and liked it so well that I switched my major and graduated with a degree in English and a minor in zoology. Then went on to Syracuse University, where I had a creative writing fellowship. And I think that all kind of falls together. And all through this time, I was listening to stories being told from different people. When I was at Syracuse, for example, I used to ride my motorcycle out to the Onondaga Reservation and sit around in the general store with my dear friend De Wasenta and her mother and just listen to what they had to say. And luckily, I have a good memory. And then after Syracuse, I went to West Africa for 3 years and absorbed the oral tradition there as well, and also learned a great deal about this country from living in another country, which is an Black African nation, where I was a minority, and where family and storytelling was actually very similar to how it is in indigenous communities in this country. So that's a little bit about my background. And one more thing, although I was predominantly a poet and known for my poetry and published a number of books of poetry, having children of my own, two sons, Jim and Jesse, who are now in their 50s, when they were kids, I told them stories, traditional stories drawn from Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, who were the people whose traditional homelands are very close to mine, around mine. And I met and learned from Haudenosaunee people, such as my friend Ray Dahanadolan's Fadden, who founded the Six Nations Iroquois Museum. And those stories seemed appropriate for my kids to hear. And a friend of mine who ran a small press, John Gill, ran something called the Crossing Press, began publishing books for children and asked me if I had any stories I told my kids. So I put together a collection of Abenaki stories, which he didn't like that well. Then I put together a collection of Seneca stories, and those were published. And by the way, those Abenaki stories were later published as the Wind Eagle and have been used throughout New England for the last several decades and are pretty widely known. And that really started me on the path to being a storyteller. Oh, by the way, I was invited to the Brooktondale Elementary School after that first book of traditional Seneca stories, which was called Turkey Brother and Other Iroquois Stories, came out. They wanted me to read from the book, and I took a look at the class of fourth graders and put the book down. I said, let me just tell you the stories. That was my first storytelling outside of my family, and from then on, I guess I just have never looked back.
That's really wonderful. We don't often hear from people who's like one of the foundational things in their life and their creative practice is listening. So that's really, really cool. I'm curious, do you have any of those poems memorized that you could maybe recite to us really quick?
The ones that I wrote?
Yeah, or even one that you love and is a top of mind or something?
Absolutely, absolutely. I have
Me
so
too.
many poems I memorized as a kid. I used to drive my English teachers crazy in high school because they would be reading a poem from a book and I would be in the back row reciting it 2 lines ahead of them.
Oh, that is so funny.
I'd also do funny things, but I loved meter. For example, trochaic. Christopher Robin goes hoppity, 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 hop. Whenever I tell him politely to stop it, he says, you can't possibly stop. If he stopped hopping, he couldn't go anywhere. Poor little Christopher couldn't go anywhere. That's why he always goes hoppity, 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 hop. So you can see how the rhythm of that is very
Yeah.
easy to remember. But also, I would sometimes goof around, which drove my English teachers crazy. For example, there was a song called Hernando's Hideaway. There is a dark, secluded place, a place where lovers may embrace, etc. So that's the same rhythm as Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Eve. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. Boom, boom. So
So
I do
cool.
that kind of stuff as well.
Oh gosh, I love that so much. Don't know if I ever have memorized a poem, and you bringing this up reminds me that I need to at least have one memorized.
Yeah, my old dear friend Robert Bly, Robert told me you should memorize poems. And he
Yeah.
always encouraged people who did writing workshops with him to memorize poems. And when I was at Cornell, I had to memorize the entire poem Lycidas by John Milton. Yet once more ye laurels and once more ye myrtles brown with ivy, never sir I come to pluck your petals harsh and never mind, I won't go any further with that. But it's about a 10-page poem.
Wow. That is very impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I wish I could memorize poetry like that.
Well,
Uh,
it's easy to also remember stories. If I hear a story once, I will remember it. I don't have to write it down. And I think that there's a thing about stories, that stories have a living shape to them. It's not just beginning, middle, and end, but it is of the way the story has itself a life. And I like to connect to that life and honor it by telling the story.
yeah. I like that you talk about the beginning and middle and end, and as maybe somebody who I'm kind of newer to the publishing world, newer to books. Do you have any advice for maybe somebody starting in their writing career or in storytelling? Like what piece of advice would you give them?
Well, I think one thing we learn by copying, we learn by hearing how others and seeing how others do things. And one thing I used to do when I was a beginning poet was to take a poem I loved and then try to write something in the same line length, the same images, but different, that related to that particular poem. And it gives you a sense of voice. Then you learn your own voice. And of course, now we have digital devices, so we can dictate into them. And by dictating something in there, you remember it and you catch the sound of your own natural voice, how you speak. Often people feel they have what they call writer's block. I don't believe in it. I think it's just a way to keep ourselves from making mistakes. We're afraid we won't do well, because you can always write words down. And if you can't, I tell young writers, dictate them into your phone.
Mm.
And you'll be amazed how much you can do that way. Every morning when I walk my dogs, I dictate at least one haiku or another poem into the phone. And I actually wrote an entire book, which is called Res Dogs. It came out about a year ago. It's in poetry. And this was dictated every morning as I walked my dogs. So I think that that's another thing you can remember. Also, don't be afraid to make a mistake. Don't think it's going to be perfect the first time around. If you want to be a writer, you have to write, plain and simple. If you want to be read, you have to rewrite, because rewriting makes writing worth reading. And another very dear friend of mine, I'm going to drop a lot of names, but I have to acknowledge people.
Do.
William Stafford, one of the great poets of the 20th century and a very, very dear friend. Bill would get up each morning and go into his study and look out the window and then start typing based on what he saw. And maybe what he started typing wouldn't even show up in the eventual poem, but it was a way of getting going. He described writing poetry as trying to start a car on ice. If you try too fast, the wheels will spin. Just gradually build up speed, and pretty soon you're going along at a good clip. I was actually, once when I was staying with Bill out in Lake Sunnydale, Oregon, he said, "Joe, you can sleep in my study, and my typewriter where I write every morning is in the study, and you can use it." I thought, awesome. I'll get up early in the morning, and I'll write a poem on Bill Stafford's typewriter based on what I see out the window. So I got up, sat in front of the typewriter, put a piece of paper into it, and then I heard from the other room, click, 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 click. I looked out the door. Bill had another typewriter. He'd already written 3 poems before I left.
That's really cool. I'm also, as you bring that up, I'm curious how, if anything, your writing practice when you're writing poetry. And in A Year of Moons, you talk a little bit about your daily haikus. How does that differ from when you're writing nonfiction or fiction, more prose writing?
Well, I'd say nonfiction, there's an immense amount of research that goes into it. Plus, if it's nonfiction about something which is related to a particular people, a particular time, you need to spend a lot of time with those people and with that time. I'm just finishing off, actually, it's in copy editing now, a book about the Alcatraz takeover in 1969 by the Indians of all tribes. I've done interviews with half a dozen people who were there, who were part of it. And I've given them drafts of what I've written, and then they've gone through it with a fine-tooth comb and corrected my mistakes. And that is one reason why when I write nonfiction, it takes longer than writing fiction, because nonfiction requires that very close attention to detail and being truthful. And often I read books that are supposedly nonfiction, and I find myself gritting my teeth when I find out-and-out errors that they could have corrected had they turned to the people who know. And one thing about writing about Native people, about indigenous people, often non-indigenous writers have written books and never spoken to an Indian, never spoken to the people the books are about, or their descendants. You know, if I write a book about Sitting Bull, I talk with Sitting Bull's descendants. From this tribal nation, I visit the area where he lived, and I see those things for myself. I don't just imagine it or taking secondary or tertiary sources as a way of relating to it. In terms of writing fiction, unlike poetry, where you can finish at least a first draft of a poem in a short time, in terms of writing fiction, it's a long run. And so I try to write every day, at least, let's say, 3 pages, sometimes more. And as I accumulate more and more pages, the shape of the book begins to grow. And by the way, here's a trick or a little bit of information for you young writers, and that is that foreshadowing is what you put in later in the story. Because often you realize, oh, I need to foreshadow this. You go back to chapter 1, and in of course, the old movie trope is if you see a gun in the first reel, it's going to be fired by the end of the novel, the end of the movie. So the same thing is true of foreshadowing. Often you forget to foreshadow as you're writing. Then you go back, and that's one thing in the process of revision, that idea of rewriting and putting things in that weren't there that needed to be there. Plus, I'm very careful with my prose. I think that prose should be at least as carefully chosen as the words in a poem. Admittedly, every word in a poem has to count, and perhaps not every word in prose counts as much, but it has to count for something. So if you are repeating the same word again and again, you're blowing it. If you see a paragraph where you have because, and then because, and then because, and you've got 4 becauses in one page, I think that's a good reason to look at some other way of saying it, because it's very repetitive when you say because too many times.
So does that indicate that you're probably a very careful, you have a very careful revision process?
I do. I revise very carefully, and my wife, Nicola, reads everything I've written and often will hand it back to me marked up before I ever get it to an editor. She's a very good writer and also the Dean of Arts and Humanities at Empire State College. So
Oh, wow, that's cool.
I like to say I'm good at marrying women who are smarter than I am.
Hey, it's a good talent to have. Oh, that's cool.
That's another thing. One of the things about our indigenous cultures is that if you don't recognize the power and the importance of women, you are really a dummy. That's something that I grew up knowing, being raised by grandparents with a very powerful grandmother, by having women teachers and sort of guides throughout my life. I have been very blessed that way.
That's very wonderful.
Yeah, that is really nice. And you mentioned different guides throughout your life. Who are some people that you feel have guided you and mentored you, and what is the best piece of advice you think you would like to share with us that they've given you?
Well, I've already mentioned listening, but I also think that, for example, when I was in graduate school at Syracuse University, I had gone there thinking that they wanted me for my prose, but in fact they wanted me for my prose and my poetry, and it turned out they were fighting over which one I would be following. I ended up doing both and studying with Philip Booth, who was a wonderful poetry teacher and became a dear friend. But my primary person in prose was an incredible writer named Grace Paley. Grace was just amazing, a wonderful prose craftsperson, and she recognized the importance of every word counting. But when I got in her class, I had taken a class before that from a teacher who was only there for 1 semester, and he just ripped apart everything I wrote to the point where I was very discouraged. And Grace took one look at me and said, "Oh, you poor baby." And the Jewish grandmother in her came out, and she proceeded to really build me back up again. Don't be discouraged. Don't give up. That was one thing Grace taught me. If you think you're at the end of your rope, you can always add more rope. And that was what Grace gave me, that understanding that just because someone didn't like what you wrote doesn't mean it's bad, and also doesn't mean you can't make it better. And I learned that from Grace, and will always be eternally grateful to her. She stayed a lifelong friend after my year at Syracuse University.
Yeah, I like that kind of balance that you talk about, taking in any criticism, but also being encouraged that it can make you better.
Absolutely. And I have to also, thinking of women who were very important to me, I'd have to mention Dewa Senta Alice Papineau, who was the clan mother of the Eel clan at the Onondaga Reservation. And Dewa Senta was just such a good person to listen to. I'd go to her little gift shop that she had on the reservation and sit around the stove with her. And we would just talk, and she would tell me things. For example, she said that, whenever I drink water, I always say thank you to the water before I drink it because it's a great gift. And I would say, well, you need to be right now. Such a good thing. And little teachings like that go a long way. Very small things, but they have very big consequences. She was the one who gave me my Onondaga name. I've been given names by several different Native nations, and I don't usually use them in public. I think I'm just Joe Bruchac, but I'm honored by those names, so that she gave me the name Ganigohio. Ganigohio means the good mind, and it refers to the tradition or the story or the understanding that goes back anciently in Haudenosaunee culture, that there were twin brothers. One was the twisted mind and one was the good mind. And you have to be aware of which one you are listening to at any given time. The twisted mind, which is selfish and angry, or the good mind, which is generous and sharing, and thoughts rise toward the Creator. So when she gave me that name, she also gave me a lacrosse stick and an eagle feather with the name written down on a piece of paper, and said, go to my niece, Audrey Shenandoah, who is another friend of mine. She'll tell you how to pronounce your name.
That's really cool. I mean, I think it's just so wonderful that you've kind of collected these stories and experiences throughout your life, and they've impacted your writing and your storytelling, which kind of leads me to my next question, which is about teachers who would like to incorporate storytelling practices into their classroom, but maybe don't know where to start. Maybe they find it intimidating, or they don't think that they can tell a story without something written in front of them. What advice do you have for them?
Well, I think first reading aloud to your class is a really good way to understand the cadence and the movement of a word and of a sentence and of a story. And by reading aloud, and I recommend that very strongly. I think you should read aloud to your students, no matter how old or how young they are. And don't expect them to read it themselves aloud. That really puts them on a spot. They actually did a study and discovered that when they were dealing with reluctant and bad readers, people just couldn't read well in high school, they set up a special class where every day for half an hour, they listened to a book being read, a book that interested them. And at the end of the semester, all of them had improved in their reading skills, not by reading aloud themselves, but by hearing the reading and becoming involved in the story. And therefore, you have a sense of the reward that a story can give you. I think that being able to tell a story doesn't mean you have to memorize a story word for word. Often you can tell your own story, and that will mean something to people. I remember one of my best teachers in grade school was Miss McTighe, Frances McTighe. When I was in sixth grade, she actually brought me a little sapling maple tree, which my grandmother and I then planted in the backyard. It's still here, taller than the house.
Wow.
And she told me the story of how once when she and her sister were walking when they were children, they had gotten lost and were walking a long, long way, and they came to a house and knocked on the door. There was a woman there who was very friendly and brought them in and warmed them up, and then gave them bread with lard on it. And they ate it, and she said it was the best thing I'd ever tasted, even though it was just bread, stale bread with lard on it. She said, I learned so much that day, what it means to be kind and also what it means to be hungry. And I've never forgotten that little story that she told me in fourth grade. And that was a personal story, something that happened to her. And I have a little sort of a kind of an approach I use. I sometimes would take something like my drum as a visual, and I'd say, you see, there are 4 dots on the drum, and those stand for 4 things that you need to do: to listen, to observe, to remember, and to share. That's a good teaching. I got that from Harold Tantaquidgeon, who was a Mohegan elder about maybe 35 years ago. But also, to me, it stands for the 4 roots that we all have for our storytelling. First of all, we have ancestry. You know, who were your ancestors? What were their histories? What were their songs? What were their stories? You can research that very easily. Secondly, your family. What are the stories of your family, your personal family, those who are right there with you? And it might be stories about how they traveled from one place to another, or what it was like when they were your age, or an important thing that happened to them. And those are stories. We always have older relatives who are ready to tell us stories at the time. Oh, no, not Uncle Frank telling a story. Well, this time listen to Uncle Frank. You might hear something really interesting. So family is very important. By the way, our names come into play there. Everyone has a name, and your name has a story connected to it. For example, Bruchac is Bruchac in Slovak. My father's side of the family is European. And it could mean bear growling, or it could mean big belly. Everybody has a name that has a meaning, and there's often a story connected with your name. Then the third thing is place. Every place where you are has stories. And one thing I use to get kids going, whether high school or grade school kids in storytelling workshops, is telling them a ghost story, which is always rooted in place. And then say, why don't you find out what ghost stories are here in your town and come back and bring them to class tomorrow? And oh my gosh, the excitement that it causes and the stories they come back with. Some are the old tropes that everybody's heard before, the hook hand hanging on the door of the car, something like that. But then there's also something totally unique to that place you've never heard before. I know when I do workshops on the Onondaga Native Reservation, I sometimes do that. And the stories I've heard about Onondaga, ghost stories there, are just amazing. Then the fourth thing you have is your own personal experience. Because what happens to you is yours. And if you don't tell your story, someone else might tell it about you. And one thing I do, I said one thing a lot, haven't I? One approach that I have is to say, what was the worst day you ever had, for example, in high school? Now tell me about it, but this time you take control of it because it's not going to hurt you. Maybe even you'll find yourself laughing or learning from it. And I do that myself. I tell them a story that I had happened to me in high school, and they end up laughing. But I said, yeah, I learned a lesson from that. So that's one thing that you can do. And there are so many different ways you can approach this. I actually wrote a book, now out of print, called Tell Me a Tale, a book about stories and storytelling. And it has a lot of those little tips in it that you can follow. So Tell Me a Tale, you may be able to find a used copy if you go on the internet.
Yeah, it sounds like there are lots of different stories that we all have. And I like that you have like the 4 different types of stories. Is there a story that you find yourself coming back to in your own life? And maybe could you tell us that story?
Well, what comes immediately to mind in this building is about my grandfather. I was his shadow. I followed him everywhere when I was a little kid. And actually, a picture on my autobiography, Bowman's Store, of the two of us standing together. I'm about maybe 2 years old, and he's holding my hand, and we're wearing the same clothing. And my grandfather had this thing he used to do. He was never afraid of heights, and I've never been afraid of heights either. Depths worry me, but not heights. And he would go out behind the house, and he would take this ladder and put it up against the house, and he'd climb the ladder up to the roof, which is like 3 stories tall. He's doing this in his 70s, and he'd go up, he said, to check the peak. It's what he'd say to my grandpa, got to check the peak, make sure it's okay. And what he actually was doing is getting away from my grandmother asking him. And, he'd go up there and, lean against the chimney and smoke his pipe. One day he decided to check the peak, and he got up to the top of the ladder, got up on the roof, and he heard a little voice going, ooh, ah. I had followed him up the ladder. I was 2.5 years old. And there I was on top of that ladder, holding out with one hand, look out, ooh, ah. My grandfather did not panic. He did not shout. He did not try to grab me. He said, oops, forgot my hammer. We better go back down, Sonny. And then I started back down the ladder. And next thing I knew, my grandfather was sort of over the top of me going down that ladder at the same time. And he did the darndest thing. He'd been so eager to get that hammer. But when he got down the bottom, he just laid that ladder down on the ground and sat with his arms around me for a long time, patting his chest. Going, oh, I couldn't understand that. That's a true story of my childhood about my grandfather.
Oh, that's pretty great. I can't imagine my 3-year-old doing something like that. So that's pretty great. I can empathize with your grandfather.
I like to tell it partially from my grandfather's point of view, or from my point of view at that time, which was I didn't have any idea that I was doing something that was endangering my life. I just sort of followed my grandfather.
That's amazing. So we are actually at my favorite part of the podcast, which is called Hey, What You Reading, where we get to ask book people what they're reading and add to our never ending to be read list. So Kelly and I actually have two questions for you. So we'll start out with the first one. I'm curious what kind of poetry you're reading these days.
Well, I have to say, I read very widely. I'm always reading the Poetry Society of America and the Poetry Magazine websites where they have poems posted every day. So I read all kinds. I also read poems in other languages, which I find very inspiring. I like German a lot.
Mm.
But, what I've been reading lately, I think I sent you a picture of this, is Mary Oliver's selected poems. Mary Oliver was one of the great poets of America.
Yes, she
Uh,
was.
She is still in my heart and hearts of many people. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read one poem of hers.
I would love that.
And it's one that from a book of hers, which was actually about dogs. It was called Dog Songs, published in 2013. And I love it because of my own very strong relationship with dog people. They have always been part of my life. This one's called The Storm. Now, through the white orchard, my little dog romps, breaking the new snow with wild feet. Running here, running there, excited, barely able to stop, he leaps, he spins, until the white snow is written upon in large, exuberant letters, a long sentence expressing the pleasures of the body in this world. Oh, I could not have said it better myself.
Mm, that's amazing. She is one of my favorites as well, and I try to reread at least one of her books once a year, just kind of to like get yourself back grounded with everything. So thank you for sharing that. I think poetry should always be read aloud, so I appreciate you reading that poem aloud as well. Kelly, what are you reading?
Well, I couldn't pick just one. I fell into two books like we do sometimes. So my first one is Where the Sidewalk Ends, Shel Silverstein, classic. I love Where the Sidewalk Ends because it was my introduction into poetry. When I was growing up, I thought poetry was something for the adults in my life, not for kids. And so I just really found Shel Silverstein to make poetry really accessible, and it opened up the world of poetry to me.
The slithery D came out of the sea. The slithery D came out of the sea. It caught all the others, but it won't catch me. You won't catch me. You won't.
Oh, that's great. Shel Silverstein will always have a special place in my heart.
Totally.
And then my second one is a collection of poems by Seamus Haney.
Oh, yeah.
I absolutely love Seamus Haney and how he can tell story through poetry, and create such vivid pictures. His poem, Blackberry Picking, I just love how he brings out the excitement of kids picking berries in the summer and getting their fingers all sticky. And at the same time, he talks about the disappointment when you find that they've gone rotten. Just the different emotions that he captures, like on both ends, both the excitement and the disappointment. I also think that Seamus Haney also goes to maybe some more negative emotions that people don't talk about a lot, especially in his poem Midterm Break, which is one of my favorites, even though it's a sad poem about the death of his brother. You can tell he's processing through the emotions that he's feeling, that his family is feeling. And I just really like that he's able to capture some of those deeper emotions that sometimes we're afraid to go to that place. So yeah, I would highly recommend that.
Adding it to my list right now.
Yeah, I think of his poem Digging, which is one of my favorite poems by Seamus Haney.
Oh, that's a classic.
And of course, basically he's digging with the pen.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful poem. And I have it in my memory on my phone. I just have to tap on it.
Oh,
It comes up,
that's great.
between my finger and my thumb. The squat pen rests snug as a gun. This wonderful poem. I recommend it.
Yeah, that one's a great one as well. How about you, Terry? What do you?
So I'm doing another reread. I find myself rereading poetry, probably more than I reread like fiction and nonfiction, almost like ritualistically with the seasons. And I find that when we're kind of nearing the end of summer, even though it doesn't feel like it because it's so hot, I always want to read Jack Gilbert again. So I'm reading Jack Gilbert's collected poetry, which I actually didn't find until 2020, I think. And he has very quickly become maybe one of my favorite poets. I have just the big like collected version of all of his poems, but so many of them are dog-eared, highlighted, underlined. But if you need a little introduction to Jack Gilbert, I would definitely recommend checking out It's Difficult to Speak to the Night. That is one of my favorite poems by him. So
Yeah, wonderful poem.
he's great. So we have one more recommendation question. Kelly, do you want to start this one off? I think we were going to ask what your favorite books for like really good stories are like. What are the books that you go back to that just tell stories really well?
Mhm. Well, I would say I definitely could always go back to The Jungle Book. The
Yeah,
Jungle Book is a very interesting book, and actually, the Graveyard Book is based on The Jungle Book, except with
really.
ghosts. Yeah, it's basically the same story, but that character raised by ghosts. So it's building on that. But the Jungle Book is fascinating because what Kipling did was to introduce into Western literature a brown protagonist. Remember,
Mm.
the main character is an Indian boy, not a white boy. And also to introduce the wolf as a positive animal, which it is, in fact, in many of our native cultures and other parts of the world, whereas it's not the big bad wolf of Little Red Riding Hood. And that whole idea of communication with the natural world and being connected to it, that a human being can have that, it's a very subversive book, quite frankly, a very subversive book. And I like it for that as well as for the beauty of the storytelling. And I can go back again and again to many of my favorite books that have that kind of power. And Scott Mamaday is a dear friend of mine. And although everyone spoke about The Way to Rainy Mountain, which one, actually, excuse me, not that, I talk about The Way to Rainy Mountain, which is a collection of stories told in a traditional story and then a modern story facing it. And that book about the part of Oklahoma that his Kiowa people come from, to me, is a great read, and it's very poetic prose. So, and Scott Mamaday, I can return to again and again.
Wonderful. More books to add to our list. How about you, Kelly?
I took the question in a slightly different way. And so one of my favorite books about storytelling is The Dragonfly Effect. And it kind of talks a little bit about what you were talking about earlier, Joe, where they're like the 4 parts of a story and what you need to do to make your story take flight. So like each of the wings on the dragonfly. So that I would say is one of my favorites in helping me when I'm telling stories and learning how to be a better storyteller.
Yeah, actually, there's a formula, D3R, which is departure, difficulty, discovery, and return. You can apply that 4-part structure to fairy tales. You can apply it to many different things, where there is a departure, a difficulty, a discovery, a solution of the problem, and then the return. And that is something that I have used for years as an example of how there is this sort of structure to story. And if you've left out one part of that, it's not going to work. It's just like not building up to the punchline in a joke, having something left out so that the joke makes no sense, or forgetting the punchline. so you don't complete it. And within Native American Indian culture, jokes are really important. People are always telling jokes, and often those jokes, like a good story, are meant to entertain, but also to teach. That joke may indeed be a way of pointing out something you need to know without doing it in a very sort of obtrusive or shaming way. And I like the idea that often in our stories, traditional stories, we don't make other people look stupid. In fact, sometimes we make ourselves look stupid. But, putting other people down is not something I think really works for stories or storytelling. And it's okay to have yourself be the butt of your own joke.
That's cool. That's very cool.
How about you, Kateri?
So this is one where I picked 2 books for, mainly because I just finished a book that I think everybody else read like years ago when it came out, and I like just got around to it. It's Searcy by Madeleine Miller. It was a book club book. I don't know why I waited so long. It is so good. And I think it's that really, really good storytelling because she's using old, like Greek myth and folklore, and she's turning it into like a book that's really, really like fun and engaging. The characters are amazing. Yeah, it's really fun. I can't wait to read her other books. So that was my first pick. My second pick, which I go back to all the time, is Toni Morrison largely, but if I have to choose just one, I'm gonna choose Song of Solomon for this, because as Joe was mentioning, the importance of names and storytelling, that book has really, really good names. We've got Milkman, we've got Guitar, and the structure of the book is just it's this like beautiful river kind of all of these things that are happening in the community into the main characters, and it flows really wonderfully. And her writing is just, you like want to take a bath in it. It's so good. So those are probably recently, and maybe not so recently, some of my favorite books with like excellent storytelling in them.
Toni Morrison is one of my heroes. I think that The Bluest Eye, I mean, you can't name a book of hers without going, oh my gosh.
No. I actually have the last 2 lines of Jazz tattooed on my leg because it's my favorite book ever. And that's another one. I reread that book every Christmas. She's so good.
Got an opportunity to be part of a seminar with Toni Morrison, and she was then acting as an editor for a press, and she was saying that it's so hard back then, over 20 years ago, to get ethnic writers published, but it will be different in the future. And I think we're seeing that now. That there's a tremendous explosion of work by all kinds of people with all kinds of point of view that are not just white, straight male. And that idea of the diversity of literature is one of the things I'm constantly celebrating and trying to point out to others.
There's a lot to be celebrated, especially right now. I think we're seeing a lot of really amazing stuff coming out and being recognized. And it's fun to be part of all of that right now. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Joe. This was an amazing conversation. I've added lots of books to my to-be-read list. And for those listening, Joe's book comes out this fall, A Year of Moons, Stories from the Adirondack Foothills. You can actually purchase it on our website right now, and you'll get it before it's available. And it'll be autographed. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. Keep an eye out for more episodes coming soon. And happy reading.
Happy pumpkinning. Travel well.